Imagine a literary landscape where murderers have Alzheimer's, vegetarians transform into plants, and authors vulnerably disclose their therapy sessions or how they were able to get rich. I spent 6 months in South Korea and have learned to greatly appreciate the culture and my day-to-day life there. Being a reader, I naturally started to wonder about how the themes, narrative, and storytelling styles of authors that grew up in this country would differ from the style that I'm usually used to, which is that of Westerners. How do protagonists' traits differ? How do self-help books change in the way they try to help? And what can these things tell us about the country that these books originate from? I'm going to try to answer these questions by reading the top 6 best-selling books in South Korea of the last 6 years. Well, the ones that were available in English translation anyway. Keep in mind that this is a quest driven by curiosity. I'm not a sociologist or an expert on South Korea. I simply want to discover the insights I can gain about a nation through its most popular books. Let's get started. That was dramatic.
So this book offers a unique perspective on Korean society and its cultural values, while also serving as a guide for self-improvement. The author touches on various themes, such as individualism versus collectivism, friendship, and the meaning of life, all while providing insightful commentary and analysis. Although the concepts provided in the book are not entirely new, the author's approach to them is fresh and relatable. The book is also written in a very digestible format, with short sections and bold-faced title and conclusions. Overall, it is a worthwhile read for anyone seeking a perspective on personal growth through the lens of Korean society. The book is the book is written in a way that mimics you having a conversation with the author, although the conversation is one-sided. The only issue with books like this one is that since they don't do an extensive job as explaining each topic they discuss, you might easily forget about the content as a whole. With that being said, I do think the book offers a rather biased perspective on facets of Korean culture because the author seems to be quite fed up with it, and he tints the pages of his book with this frustration. This can sometimes have the effect of him stating things or concluding things that may seem a bit emotionally not well thought out. Here are some examples. On page 166, he says this: I don't think individualism is the solution because individualist societies have a lot of issues and collectivist society also have a lot of issues, so obviously it's not black or white. And page 189, where he says that cowards are undeserving of love, which is interesting. There are also lots of references in the book on Korean society written by other books, which are mostly sociology books. So if you read this book, it could serve as a nice little metaphorical lily pad for you as a frog to jump on to see other lily pads that are, in this case, the books recommended in this book. This metaphor doesn't make any sense. When you read the book, you can sometimes feel like you're getting multiple slaps in the face, but they aren't slaps meant to hurt you. They're slaps meant to gently wake you up if you're sleeping and revitalize you if you're not energetic, if that makes sense. So they're like slaps to make you snap back into reality. I grew up in Lebanon, and although individualism isn't as emphasized as it is in the West, collectivism isn't nowhere near what it is in Korea. So although I grew up thinking that I should value my family's opinion because my life affects their lives and I should take them into consideration when I make major life decisions, I was still free to think about what I really want in life and why I want it. I'm not saying every Lebanese person is like me. Some are way more collectivist, some are way more individualistic, but more or less Lebanon as a whole falls between the West and the East, which is why it's called the Middle East. My point is, for anyone that has grown up asking themselves questions about why they want X, Y, and Z, some chapters might feel odd, because from what I've gathered from this book, a lot of Koreans don't even ask themselves what they want from life and what actually makes them happy, because it's just not the way they're raised. They're not given the framework to have this specific thought process, or maybe because of the crazy time they dedicate towards education and career, they don't even have the time to think about these types of questions. The book discusses important concepts like self-reliance, accountability, and authenticity, as well as complex issues like social mobility. which is huge in Korea and the rest of the world, but pretty huge in Korea, and the role of money and the nature of hope. It can be invaluable to the right reader, I think, and I recommend this book. If you live in an individualistic culture, I think that you'll find it quite interesting because the reflections and day-to-day life examples have a high chance of feeling foreign and new to you. If you live in a more collectivist culture, you'll find some sections peculiar, but you would have probably come across the majority of what the author writes. If you're just interested in Korean culture, it's not as deep. Like, it's not a sociology book, but it's a good book to start with. It's not groundbreaking, but it's quite interesting and made me realize, like, whether a culture is individualist or collectivist or in between, it actually affects the majority of facets of its citizens' lives. Like, you end up having different values, pursuing different things, having a different type of life, taking things into consideration that someone in another culture, the other side of the world, wouldn't even think about when making life decisions.
This is a man's world, but he wouldn't be nothing, nothing without a woman or girl.
A quick synopsis of the book. The story is about a woman named Kim Ji-young, and it follows her everyday life from her birth in 1982 until 2016, the year the book was published. I'm gonna remove my jacket because it makes a lot of sound. Anyway, Kim Ji-young is supposed to represent the average Korean woman. Her experiences easily superimposed upon those of the women living during the same time as her. As such, her life is interlaced with systemic misogyny from start to end. As a kid whose needs are placed below that of her brother, in school and university where her place is constantly threatened due to its lack of relevance, and in the workplace where her work is plagued by the very start due to her label as a woman who will eventually become a wife and then a mother. The men in her life are not all machos. Some are just solely unaware of the implications of being a woman that solely affect and alter her life. In times of economic hardships, it is the women that are laid off of the workplace. And in the family, it is the women that are supposed to make the sacrifice, to forgo the jobs, the dreams, the aptitudes, for the well-being of their children whose emotional and mental needs seem to fall mostly on them, be it due to biology or society. The book emanates with quiet powerlessness and self-alienation, with mothers apologizing to their mothers-in-law for having girls instead of boys. If you're listening to all of this and you're thinking it's a bit dramatic, I can attest to this being the reality of a lot of people, at least in my country. The book is also not making anything up. A big aspect of it is the integration of data. It gives us stats, integrating different aspects of Korean society and culture through different numbers and citations. It garnered a lot of attention in South Korea, where different women in different fields started speaking publicly about how they could relate to the book. And a lot of men started criticizing it. This is another book where I think how much you like it will depend on which type of society you were raised in. And if you've been able to talk about your struggles and, like, you know, not pretend that they don't exist. Seen from a non-biased lens, it's not an amazing book. It's quite ordinary, and I would have probably given it a 3 instead of the 4/5. I did not hit a personal string in my soul. I didn't grow up in the West, and my country's laws do not reflect equality yet, so this book hit close to home. Initially, I thought that women of the West wouldn't really relate to this book, but after having discussed it with my French friends and having read reviews by Canadians and Americans, unfortunately, women still relate to a lot of these things. A lot of the things said in the book. If you read this book as a guy, you will understand women a bit more. And understanding heals patience and wisdom. So earlier I said that the book was polarizing. I think that the polarization is due to the fact that this book is one-sided. Yes, women have it bad, but by contrast, the book portrays men as having it all. They are the chosen gender. They are the one we value, the one we place our hopes and dreams on, the one we sacrifice for, so that they reach their dreams in glory, while our needs are peripheral to theirs. I say this as someone who isn't Korean, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, but I think I can understand why some men might feel triggered by this book,
book just because it inadvertently belittles their own suffering and makes them feel like they should be content and happy with their lives because it is so easy in contrast to ours. But Korean men have compulsory military service for 2 years, which women are exempted from. And although the outlook is slowly changing, the majority of the duty of being a provider tends to fall on them. Now, you may think that as a woman, our lives are still way harder than theirs because you have to bear children, to take care of them, to educate them, to care for them emotionally, mentally, physically, which takes more than 2 years. And being a mother and a wife and a house taker, let's call it like that, takes more than 2 years. But my whole point here is that this shouldn't be a competition on who's suffering more, on who has it harder. When we say that women have it harder, a lot of men get triggered. And when men say that men have it harder, a lot of women get triggered.
But the only thing we should get triggered about is the system.
These sentiments of anger shouldn't be targeted towards the opposite sex. They should be targeted towards the overall structure of the world, where laws, systems, and customs no longer corresponds to our wants and needs of freedom and equality. And where even new laws, customs, and systems don't take differences into account by trying to be overly equal. Differences like biology that we can't really get over. I think the book wouldn't have received as much of a backlash by men if it had incorporated a more nuanced form of storytelling. Anyway, I still think it's great. It's better to talk about issues than not to talk about them at all. And if you wait for the ability to perfectly talk about a subject, you'll end up never talking about it. The Vegetarian by Han Kang focuses on a woman who decides to become a vegetarian and the intense and violent reactions to that news of the people around her. While this plot summary might seem boring or mundane, the events that transpire are anything but. To call this book strange would be an understatement. It is unsettlingly eerie and might be even disturbing to some. The story is chronologically told from the perspective of 3 different protagonists in her life, and thus the book is separated in 3 different parts. According to the blurb, the book is said to be an allegorical novel about modern-day South Korea, but also about the shame, desire, and our faltering attempts to understand others. This book managed to capture my attention from its very first sentence. Before my wife turned vegetarian, I'd always thought of her as completely unremarkable in every way, which is quite a curious statement. What I like the most about this work, which is almost prevalent throughout all of the pages, is the blatant honesty and complete lack of political correctness of the characters. Nowadays, it's very popular to be politically correct and very inoffensive. And although many of us like to claim that we love relatability, this tends not to apply to thought processes or perspectives that might seem vile or unpleasant to state. The author throws that inoffensiveness out the window and marks the pages of the book with sentences like, "The inferiority complex I used to have about the size of my penis." Or paragraphs where the author complains about his wife choosing to go braless because according to him, her boobs aren't shaped for that kind of exposure and he's embarrassed by what his acquaintances might think about her not having a bra. These 2 examples are the less blatant ones and they're at the very first chapter of the book, just to not give you a lot of spoilers. Apart from the vile honesty that makes this novel stand out, the events that occur and the way characters react to those events are also quite unnatural and obscure, and they're almost perversively refreshing in a very twisted way. I won't go into detail, but it is a disturbing, morbid, and heinous book with a high chance of making you uncomfortable. It kind of reminded me of The Stranger by Albert Camus in the sense that characters seem to be alienated by their own emotions or lack thereof. Events also share similar dimensions from the perspective that they both perturb, confuse, and disturb their readers, but The Stranger is cleaner and more humane in its perspective of life, which is strange to state, but it's the case. I personally immensely like the book, but I don't think it's meant for everyone to read. I think that it might be a bit too bleak for some and a bit too disgusting in its portrayal of humanity for others. I personally felt occasionally uncomfortable because of the ugly truths and morbid sexual events depicted throughout the book. But I personally love these types of books, so it was fine with me. If you're wondering whether or not you'd like the book and you want to pick it up, apparently, according to the reviews I've read, people that are vegetarians tend to like the book for some strange reason. And I personally think that if you're into French or indie or alternative movies or books, you'll probably also enjoy this one because it's very... For me, the only thing I couldn't quite digest in this book was the intense reaction of the husband and her family to her becoming a vegetarian. Although I personally come from a country where being a vegetarian isn't the norm at all, and people might even look at you weirdly or like judge you as being kind of odd if you tell them that you're a vegetarian, the reaction wouldn't be near this intense. So it kind of made me perplexed as to the validity of her husband and her family's reaction. I don't really know if Korean society in general would react this way, but I think it's probably an exaggeration to portray the author's intent to showcase a society with rigid norms around following the status quo. The main negative reviews that I've read on this book tend to focus on the lack of self-awareness by the characters as well as the lack of communication between them, but I think this is a very Western perspective. Usually individuals that are members of collectivist societies tend to have these characteristic traits, so I don't think it was like inaccurate of her to make her characters this way. The book has been said to be too morbidly sexual, too dark, too intense, too disturbing, which I agree with, but I like. I feel like these types of different facets that tend to make readers uncomfortable make us discover different facets of a human psyche which we don't usually encounter, which I find interesting. I want to die, but I want to eat tteokpokki. Relatable. This book serves as a sort of 3-month diary of the author's therapy sessions. It delves into her struggles during therapy. The struggles are related to self-esteem, depression, anxiety, peer pressure, and other relatable subjects, unfortunately. When I finished reading it, I was really interested in what other therapists think of the book, because throughout the book, I felt like her therapist was bad. So I read reviews by therapists on Goodreads, and it became evident that some believe the author to be experiencing severe burnout and potentially suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome, which her psychiatrist failed to mention. Throughout the session, her therapist would comment and give her form of advice. The advice did not seem useful to me, did not seem very insightful or thought-provoking. For instance, when the author expressed concern about excessive drinking, rather than exploring the reason behind her coping mechanism or behind why she's excessively drinking, her therapist simply told her to avoid the friends that peer pressure her into drinking and to not drink so much the next time. However, it is worth considering that drinking culture in Korea is quite embedded in the society, so they might not perceive it to be as big of a problem as other cultures would. The psychiatrist also explicitly criticizes the author, labeling her as immature, and she held her responsible for not disclosing the fact that, for example, she had side effects after taking the medication, but in a very parental way, not in a very psychiatrical way. Now, it's obviously delicate to judge a therapist from a country you're not from. For example, a lot of my friends who are Lebanese, who have gone to Western therapists in the States or in places in Europe, have found their therapists lacking in understanding and compassion when it came to facets of their lives. My friends would come to them with issues ranging from religious issues to familial issues to the anxiety that comes with living in a country where you don't have electricity and have gone through war-like scenarios. And these therapists would brush off some of their issues with banal phrases, because in their own cultures, family, for example, although they're valued, they're not going to necessarily make you change your mind about your future career path. And religion might not play that big of a role. And there is a difference between the concept of understanding warlike situations and actually going through them. So my friends would judge these therapists as bad, but I don't think they were bad. I just think that culture plays a big role in what you qualify as a problem in your life. All this to say that a lot of people have read this book and they judged her therapist to be a bad therapist. Now, this was me trying to play devil's advocate to perhaps see a different perspective. of the book. But I do still think her therapist is bad because the banalization of problems, if they are to be treated as non-problems, should be made by the patient and not the therapist. Unless the patient is pretending to have problems, I don't think that was what was happening. Either way, the author claims to have learned several things through her therapy sessions. She now understands that she can be herself, that she can let herself feel whatever she needs to feel, that the way she interprets events in her life strongly depend on her mood at the moment that they happen. So she gained something from her therapy. I think that this book can be educational for people that have lived in an environment that disabled their function of asking why they are the way that they are and what they want out of life, which is a common theme throughout this video. I personally think that I didn't really benefit or learn anything new from this book because these aren't my type of problems and these aren't my type of issues, and I was raised in an environment where I asked myself every single day what I wanted, which is, I guess, a form of privilege at this point. A lot of people nowadays are suffering from this form of high-functioning depression that the author seems to be suffering from, where the sentence echoing through their mind is that of, there's nothing wrong in my life, so why am I feeling this way? So you might be doing well or very well financially, you might be in a loving relationship and you might have kids, you might even have a dog that you love, and travel from time to time. So according to capitalist society, you should be happy. You've hit the jackpot. Yet you find yourself slowly decaying when it comes to happiness and your enjoyment of life. If I were to widen the lens here after everything I've read, I think I could speculate that this is the form of depression that a lot of people have in South Korea, when they are told to live a life pursuing things that they don't question and find themselves either stuck in a wheel pursuing these things or obtaining these things and not understanding that the reason they still feel empty is because they didn't really want these things to begin with. Anyway, obviously this is a problem that a lot of people have. It's not just related to South Korea in particular, but I think that when you live in such a collectivist country where the opinion of other is valued, sought out, and plays a major role in your life, then the ingredients of these different facets kind of tend to make for more extreme scenarios. Again, not a sociologist, but from the books I've read so far, this has been a common theme. Anyway, the book itself won't give you a light bulb moment, but it might make you feel heard if you've been feeling the same way for a while. It might also annoy you if you're looking for something deeper. And through that annoyance, you will be encouraged to find something deeper and maybe read another book on the subject, which is again what I did. This one is an anthology which constitutes of 1 novella and 3 short stories. Starting with the novella, it is written in the form of a diary of a murderer, hence the name. In my opinion, the originality of this work is twofold. First, it is written from the perspective of the killer, which isn't groundbreaking, but it is refreshing. Second is that the killer has Alzheimer's, which is quite an interesting dimension to adopt with such a character. When I originally read the blurb, I thought that this would be a wonderful story, but after reading it, I feel like more could have been done with the story. Particularly because if you read a lot of crime or thriller, or even if you watch a lot of crime or thriller, you kind of get bored with the typical portrayal of killers, and the protagonist in the story adheres to a lot of these stereotypes. Oh, he's a killer, he likes to read classical books that are very hard, he likes to listen to classical music, he doesn't kill for the sake of it, but he kills to rid the world of vermin, which are all noble pursuits, but at the same time, been there, done that quite a lot of times, so it becomes redundant and hence kind of boring to read. Now, the Alzheimer dimension itself is incredibly interesting. It was treated in an interesting way in the book, but again, I felt like more could have been done. When you read the blurb of something and you're like, oh my god, wow, this is so original, and then in the end, the book itself kind of lacks that originality that you thought it would provide, you're left wondering what could have been, which was my state after I finished reading that novella. So personally, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this book to anyone. It's not a bad book per se, it's just not a good book per se, it's just pretty average, I guess. I think that if you're new to crime and thriller and mystery, you'll probably like it a lot. But if you've consumed the genre a lot in the past, then you're probably gonna be like, okay, I guess this is interesting, but not really. The 3 short stories after this one are very short, so I'm not gonna give you the plot, but I will give you the general themes and my personal opinion on them. So the second story is called The Origin of Life, and it deals with abuse and cheating. I found that the characters in this short story were way better built than in the first one, and it made me want to read his other works. Apparently Kim Yong-ha is a really well-known author, and he's published a plethora of books that are wonderfully popular, and after reading the story it made me want to read his other works. So this is an interesting story, but again, it falls short, not because it's stereotypical in this case, but just because it's too fast-paced. I don't think that the format of a short story was the correct medium, or like the result felt lukewarm, it felt very abrupt, it felt very like short. I felt like maybe if it was a longer story it would have been more interesting. The third story is Missing Child. Surprisingly, this one was my favorite in the collection. It has a vivid and extremely dark portrayal of what it's like to deal with a missing child. Reading this story made me feel the gloom, the anxiety, the depression, as well as the emotions associated with a loss of self and a loss of child, if that makes sense. Not only did the parents lose their child, they also lost their sense of who they were. My only complaint was that the last couple of paragraphs felt very rushed, but then again, this is my complaint in most short stories, because I feel like there's not enough space to really develop the story properly, but otherwise I really liked it. The last story is The Rider. Here we deviate from the doom and gloom atmosphere of the other stories, and we venture into a sort of whimsical yet slightly deranged, little glimpses of insanity world. Very absurd, very comical. I liked it. I thought it was incredibly original, and surprisingly in this one I felt like the short story format was well adapted for what the author was trying to convey. So all in all, my verdict for this book is that the ideas themselves are very original, imaginative, and interesting, but their rendering lacked a certain je ne sais quoi. The je ne sais quoi was length. I'm not like a hater of short stories. I've read Ted Chiang. His short stories are marvelous. It's one of the rare authors that makes me feel like the story is fully told in a short story format. But one thing to note before we move on to the next book is that in these stories, women are portrayed in a very negative light, which was a bit odd. Not that the male are portrayed in a positive light, they're also portrayed in a negative light, but they are the perpetrators and women are the absorbers or victims of whatever the male is doing or going through. So there's a lot of violence against women, there's a lot of women adopting stereotypical gender roles, there's a lot of instability and mental issues. So this book was the #1 best-selling book in 2020 in South Korea. People said that it became the #1 bestseller because of the economic instability at the time, which continues to this day. The subject of the book falls into the business, self-help, and spirituality categories, and it has a lot of the same advice as other law of attraction and positive affirmation type of books, but this one focuses on personal finance. For people unfamiliar with the law of attraction, it's a spiritual philosophy or outlook on life, which basically claims that your thoughts have the power to influence your environment. So grossly speaking, positive thought patterns attract positive environments and negative thought patterns attract negative environments. Now, before you dismiss this as a bunch of witches playing Monopoly and calling it chess, remember the fact that quantum mechanics dictates that matter behaves like either a particle or a wave, depending on whether or not an observer consciously decides if they want to observe the matter or or not. I'm not gonna get into quantum mechanics, but all I'm trying to say is that we have physical proof that our thought patterns and consciousness influences our environment. So I'm not saying that the law of attraction is a fact of nature, but I am encouraging you to form your own opinion before you feel the need to react before societal dictations, which usually dismiss this whole thing as a sort of crystal hippie hugging. What I was trying to say eloquently but failed was that nowadays we tend to view science as this sort of new religion. So whenever there's a new way of looking at the world or interpreting the world, we tend to jump into immediately dismissing the new theory or the new interpretation because it doesn't align with what we learned in school or university or through popular science books. So please do your own research before you immediately dismiss the theory, before you jump on the bandwagon of just dismissing things because they don't seem to align with science, because I think this is inherently unscientific and more fanatic than anything. I digress. Let us go back to the book. Basically, this is a how to get rich book where the answer lies in changing your mindset. The author starts out by telling us what got her to embark on a quest for wealth in her first chapter, which enabled her to eventually meet a financial guru. The rest of the chapters are her searching for the guru, meeting her, and then learning from her and teaching us at the same time. The way the law of attraction is described in the book is a bit different than from what I've read in other books. If you already went down the path of pretend to be rich and you will be rich, you're already probably familiar with a lot of the concepts in this book. But here the author explains it differently. The book is very well written for people who are looking for specific ways to cultivate the mindset, because each chapter is written as if it were happening as you're reading the book. So the author herself is a beginner at the beginning of the book, and she learns about the mindset through the guru, and she writes about each question that arises in her mind. All of these questions and thought processes are similar to what any beginner might have when they're trying to practice the law of abundance or whatever you want to call it at the beginning of. This is a big help because personally from other books that I've read, when it came to the law of attraction, it's always like pretend and you will get, which is like, okay, but how am I supposed to pretend exactly? And if I have these doubts, then what am I supposed to do? And is this counterproductive to this thing? So I found that the book answered a lot of these questions, which was nice. With all of that being said, let us now focus on the negative. And most of them have to do with her being a bad writer. When it comes to the type and the style of her writing, I feel like she's not a good writer, at least in my humble opinion. I'm gonna give you examples. All the extra information that we get bombarded with, which serves no purpose whatsoever. This information is usually in the form of her describing how the guru walks into a room and every man looks at her and they're extremely attracted to her because she's incredibly beautiful, or like her style is super stylish. At one point there's a sentence where she's like, her makeup blended pink and coral. And the thing is, I love fashion, but there's no point in all of this extra description. Like, imagine reading a book where the author is consulting Warren Buffett and he's describing him as this sexy man. You know, when Warren Buffett walked into the cafe, every woman was looking at him. She was like, damn, that sexy ass man. What is the point of this? Now, another negative is something that might be a bit mean to say, but most readers that want to read such a book are people that are probably not doing that well financially. And the way the author portrays herself in the book is as a fellow struggler. She doesn't say that she's poor, but she's struggling. So as a reader, you're gonna feel a sense of camaraderie with her. You're gonna think, okay, we're all in this together. Let's struggle together. She knows what I've been through. You're gonna be a bit more personally and emotionally invested. However, then the author goes and tells us stuff about her life, and you find out that she owns her home, that she can't afford $600 shoes, but like she's anxious about. She can't afford to go to Bali on vacation with her husband and her son. And the thing that you come to realize is that she's not actually poor. It's more that she's financially struggling. It's more that she has money, but she's not appreciative of what she has. Or she has money, but she's anxious about spending it, which is an issue. I'm not gonna stand here and be like, oh, rich people and their problems. Everyone has problems when it comes to money, I think. But painting yourself in a picture where it's like, we're all in this together, and then telling me about these struggles, which I mean, I can't relate, it's kind of deceiving as a reader to read about. Because again, I think that I might be generalizing, but most people that gravitate towards such a book can't really afford $600 shoes. Like, for me, it's not about being anxious about affording $600 shoes. It's about the fact that I don't have $600 to spend on a shoe. Anyway, with that rant over, do I recommend the book? I do, because I personally believe in the law of attraction from a purely physics perspective. For me, it makes sense, and since reading the book, I've adopted a lot of its like cognitive processes, I guess you could say, and I've seen results. I think that if you don't believe in the law of attraction, or you're not familiar at all with it, or you're looking for something to convince you on how the law of attraction might be real, this is definitely not the book to start with. I appreciated it because I was very familiar with the law of attraction prior to reading it, and I was also very familiar with diverse spiritual philosophies that she mentions in the book. So don't let this be like an introductory course on the law of attraction, because it's kind of crap from that perspective. But if you're familiar with it and you're just looking for something to add to your arsenal, then this is definitely a good pick.